When we think of drug cartels, we think of tattooed gangsters in the jungles of Colombia or Mexico. We think of illicit speedboats running in the dark and bags of cash hidden in walls. We think of criminals operating outside the law. But the largest, most sophisticated, and most destructive drug cartel in human history was not run by a criminal. It was run by gentlemen in powdered wigs and silk suits. It was not run from a hideout in the mountains. It was run from the halls of Parliament in London and the boardrooms of the city. And its enforcer was not a hitman. It was the Royal Navy. In the 19th century, the British Empire committed one of the greatest cold-blooded crimes in the history of capitalism. To fix a trade deficit, they systematically addicted an entire civilization to hard drugs. They fought 2 wars to force the Chinese people to buy opium. They destroyed the oldest, richest empire on earth, not with better philosophy or better culture, but with silver, steam engines, and poppies. This is not just a story about drugs. It is a story about the brutality of trade balances. It is a story about what happens when a global superpower runs out of money. This is the story of the silver flow. To understand this war, you have to follow the money. And in the 1700s, the money trail began with a simple, harmless leaf: tea. By the late 18th century, Great Britain had a problem. The entire nation was addicted to tea. It started as a luxury for the rich aristocrats, but soon it became the fuel of the working class. Every factory worker in Manchester and Liverpool needed their morning cup of sugary tea to survive the brutal 16-hour shifts of the Industrial Revolution. The British government was addicted too. Taxes on tea imports accounted for 10% of the entire British government's revenue. If the tea stopped flowing, the British economy would collapse, and the government would go bankrupt. By the year 1800, the British East India Company, a massive, state-backed corporation, was importing 23 million pounds of tea every single year. But there was a catch. A fatal flaw in the system: tea only grew in China. And China didn't want anything Britain had to sell. The British traders tried everything. They tried to sell British wool to the Chinese. The Chinese said, "We have silk, which is better." They tried to sell complex mechanical clocks. The Chinese said, "We have the sun." They tried to sell pottery. The Chinese said, "We invented porcelain." The Emperor Qianlong famously wrote a letter to King George III that chilled the blood of British merchants. He wrote, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance. We have no need of your manufactures." Because China didn't want British goods, they demanded payment in the only thing that the entire world valued: silver, specifically Spanish silver dollars. This created a massive, terrifying trade imbalance. Britain was buying millions of pounds of tea, silk, and porcelain, and paying for it with ships full of silver bullion. The silver was flowing out of the Bank of England and into the vaults of the Forbidden City, and it never came back. The British treasury was bleeding dry. They were facing a currency crisis. They needed to find a way to get the silver back, or the empire would effectively run out of money. Enter the British East India Company. This was not just a company. It was the world's first corporate superstate. It had its own army of 200,000 men, twice the size of the British army. It minted its own currency. It ruled India with an iron fist. And in the fertile fields of Bengal, in India, they found the solution to their silver problem: Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. The company executives realized a dark truth about human nature. While the Chinese didn't want British wool, the human brain has a universal, biological weakness for dopamine. They realized that if they couldn't sell the Chinese a product they needed, they would sell them a product they couldn't resist. They decided to pivot from general trade to becoming the world's first industrial-scale drug cartel. They forced Indian farmers to stop growing food and start growing opium. They monopolized the production. They processed the opium into heavy, sticky balls, packed them into wooden chests, and prepared to ship them to the coast of China. But there was a legal problem. Opium was illegal in China. The emperor had banned it entirely. So the British East India Company developed a system of plausible deniability. They didn't sell the drugs directly. Instead, they sold the opium at auction in Calcutta to private traders, smugglers. These smugglers would sail to the Chinese coast and meet Chinese criminal gangs on floating warehouses in the middle of the ocean. It was money laundering on a global scale. The smugglers sold the opium for silver. They took that silver back to the East India Company in Canton. The company used that silver to buy tea. The tea went to London. The cycle was complete. The silver was finally flowing back. The plan worked with terrifying efficiency. In the year 1810, the British were shipping 4,000 chests of opium a year. By 1838, it was 40,000 chests. That is over 5 million pounds of raw opium every single year. China was flooded. The drug permeated every layer of society. It wasn't just the bored palace eunuchs or the wealthy merchants. It destroyed the army. Soldiers guarding the coast were found asleep at their posts, pipes in hand. It destroyed the labor force. Coolies on the docks spent their wages on the pipe instead of food. Opium dens sprang up in every city like a cancer. Millions of men stopped working. They lay in dark, smoke-filled rooms, dreaming away their lives while their families starved. But the economic damage was even worse than the social damage. The silver flow had reversed. For centuries, silver had flowed into China, making it the richest nation on earth. Now, silver was bleeding out at a rate of millions of ounces a year. This caused a deflationary crisis that destroyed the Chinese peasant. In imperial China, peasants used copper coins for their daily lives, but they had to pay their taxes in silver. As silver became scarcer because it was leaving the country to pay for drugs, the price of silver skyrocketed. In effect, the tax rate on the peasant doubled or tripled, simply because silver became so expensive. The economy ground to a halt. Civil unrest began to brew. The Emperor Daoguang realized his empire was dying. He famously said, "If we continue to allow this trade, in a few decades, we will have no soldiers to resist the enemy, and no silver to pay the army." He had a choice: legalize the drug and tax it, or fight a war to stop it. He chose to fight. In 1839, the emperor appointed a man named Lin Zexu as the imperial commissioner to end the trade. Lin Zexu is a hero in China today, but in the West, he is barely known. He was incorruptible. He was a man of iron principles who could not be bribed. Lin traveled to Canton, the epicenter of the smuggling trade. He didn't negotiate. He declared total war on the drug. He arrested thousands of Chinese dealers. He seized their pipes and forced addicts into rehabilitation centers. Then he turned his eyes to the foreigners. He surrounded the 13 factories, the foreign trading district where the British merchants lived. He cut off their food supplies. He pulled their servants out. He barricaded them inside. He issued an ultimatum: hand over the opium or die. After 6 weeks of siege, the British chief superintendent, Charles Elliot, surrendered. He ordered the British merchants to hand over their inventory. They surrendered 20,000 chests of opium. Lin Zexu did something unprecedented. He didn't sell it. He didn't keep it. He dug massive trenches on the beach at Humen. He mixed the opium with water, salt, and lime. He dissolved the fortune of the British Empire, millions of dollars in modern value, and flushed it into the sea. He stood on the beach and watched the black sludge wash away. He even wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, a letter that is one of the most famous documents in diplomatic history. He asked her, "By what right do you poison the Chinese people for profit? You do not allow this poison in your own land, yet you force it upon us." The letter was never delivered. The British Foreign Office ignored it. They didn't care about morality. They cared about the balance sheet. When news of the destroyed opium reached London, the Parliament was outraged. Not because their merchants were drug dealers, but because their private property had been destroyed. The powerful lobby of tea and opium merchants demanded compensation. They demanded blood. They declared war. But they called it a trade war, framing it as a defense of free trade. The British sent a fleet to China. But this wasn't a fair fight. It was a collision between the medieval world and the modern industrial world. The British unveiled a secret weapon, the Nemesis. It was the first iron-hulled, steam-powered warship to ever see combat in Asia. To the Chinese, it looked like a monster. It moved against the wind. It moved against the tide. It had no sails. It belched black smoke and fire. The Chinese junks were made of wood and bamboo. They relied on the wind. Their cannons were fixed in place. They couldn't aim. The British ships could maneuver anywhere, and their cannons could swivel and fire rapidly with explosive shells. It was a slaughter. The Nemesis sailed up the Yangtze River, destroying coastal forts and sinking the Chinese Navy as if it were target practice. The British troops, disciplined and armed with modern muskets, routed the Imperial Army. The British didn't just target the military. They understood leverage. They sailed to the intersection of the Grand Canal and the Yangtze River. The Grand Canal was the artery that brought grain and food to Beijing. By blockading this canal, the British threatened to starve the emperor in his own palace. They held the throat of the empire hostage. In 1842, the Chinese Empire surrendered. They signed the Treaty of Nanking on the deck of a British warship, the HMS Cornwallis. It was the first of what history calls the unequal treaties. The terms were brutal and humiliating. First, China had to pay 21 million silver dollars to Britain, 6 million for the opium Lin Zexu had destroyed, and millions more to pay for the cost of the war that destroyed them. The victim had to pay the bully for the beating. Second, they forced China to open 5 treaty ports to unrestricted British trade. Third, they granted extraterritoriality. This meant that British citizens on Chinese soil were immune to Chinese laws. If a British merchant killed a Chinese person, he could not be tried by a Chinese judge. And fourth, They demanded a permanent base of operations on the Chinese coast. They took a small, rocky island with a deep harbor. That island was Hong Kong. But the most humiliating part? The treaty didn't even mention the word opium. The drug trade continued, legal in all but name, protected by the guns of the British Navy. The flow of silver accelerated. The Opium Wars broke the back of the Qing dynasty. The flow of silver drained the economy. The addiction drained the spirit. The humiliation drained the authority of the emperor. This power vacuum led to catastrophe. Civil unrest exploded. The Taiping Rebellion, a civil war fueled by the economic chaos and religious madness, would kill 20 million people in the following years, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. China entered what they now call the Century of Humiliation. They went from being the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, to a carved-up colony of the West. It took them 150 years to recover, all because they wanted to sell tea, and Britain refused to pay in silver. So, what is the lesson for us today? Why does this history matter? It matters because the mechanics of economic warfare have not changed. The lesson is that trade deficits matter. When a nation cannot pay for its consumption with production, it becomes vulnerable. Britain fixed its deficit by becoming a drug dealer. Today, the drugs are different, and the currencies are digital, but the game is the same. We see trade wars, sanctions, and currency manipulation. We see nations weaponizing the supply chain. The goal is always the same: to drain the wealth of one nation into the coffers of another. The silver flow destroyed an empire that had stood for 2,000 years. It proved that no amount of culture, history, or population size can protect a nation if its financial gates are broken. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.